do celebrate St. Louis today, our patron saint. He was a great king. We have him pictured here as a king and a knight. Served as King of France for over 36 years. That's 9 presidential terms. That's a long time. And he also, though, was a man of marriage. He was married, Queen Marguerite, for 36 years. And together they had 11 children, big family. But one of his gifts was integrating his family life, his work life as king, and his prayer life as a Catholic. So big family, big job, big responsibility, so he had to have big prayer. So he went to daily Mass. He went to Mass every day, begging God for grace and wisdom to rule and serve his people well. He also prayed the Liturgy of the Hours most days, which is the prayer that priests pray 5 times a day, praying the Psalms. King Louis would pray. Every few hours he would stop and pray. He knew he needed God's grace. So he wasn't just a pious king, he was an excellent king. He, in his governance and his decisions, as well as his piety, care for the poor and the sick. And there's an image in the stained glass windows of St. Louis over here of him praying at daily Mass before he begins his day's work. But he lived family life and marriage life, and we want to consider marriage today. It's mentioned in the second reading, St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. God has a vision for human people, right? He created us and he had a plan for us. As we're down here on planet Earth, all 8 billion of us. As God looks down, his desire is that each of us have someone assigned to us who will love us unconditionally. And generally that's lived out through marriage. Someone promises on the wedding day to love you unconditionally, your husband or your wife. The good news is you get to pick the person, but once you pick them and you make that promise, then they're assigned to you for the rest of your life. That's God's vision, right? Growing up, our parents love us unconditionally, more or less. But then our parents die at some point. So who's going to fill that gap? Who's not going to give up on us when we make bad decisions or when we're sick or when we're struggling? That's a beautiful vision of marriage. We don't always live it out, but that's the goal. Now, some of us are single or celibate, like myself. Some of us have been married, but maybe sadly have experienced separation. We're not in that relationship now. But generally speaking, marriage is the vision for human beings to be serving each other, loving each other, God's plan. So we look to the reading today from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Remember, we've been reading this letter for the past 2 months. Paul wrote 14 letters of the New Testament. He wrote more than any other writer. This particular letter is written to the first Catholic community in Ephesus in Turkey. Paul's trying to encourage them because they're living in a pagan culture. These are the first converts, the first to be baptized. There's not that many. So everyone else around them is living pagan religion, not the Christian view. There's Romans with their pagan gods, and there's Greeks. And Paul's encouraging them to stay unified in their faith in Jesus. It's kind of like today. Increasingly, our United States is becoming pagan. People aren't praying to God. People don't look to Jesus for guidance. People aren't following the teachings of the Bible. They're very upfront about it. Like, that's not relevant for me. I pick my own way. So we need encouragement too. Like, stick to the Christian path. Stick to the Catholic way. So in chapter 5 of this letter, Paul speaks about marriage. It's actually the longest passage on marriage in the Bible. And he gives us some details. We heard part of the passage today in the reading. There's actually a little portion before it where Paul speaks about, he says, be subordinate to one another out of reverence for Christ. And wives, be subordinate to your husbands as to the Lord. And husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So I want to break it down a little bit. Be subordinate to one another. That's how it starts. Like, both husband and wife should put themselves in service of the other. It's two-way. Sometimes it's translated as submissive. Be submissive to one another, which comes from 2 words, sub and missio. Sub means under. Submarine goes under the water. Missio means mission. So Paul's saying, put yourself under one mission. You were 2 individuals, but you formed a new family. You got to have a common vision as a family, common mission. So you have to say no to yourself and yes to your spouse, no to yourself and yes to your children. You have to sacrifice what you want for the good of the family. Both. Be subordinate to one another. Paul says, and do it out of reverence for Christ. Do it out of love of God, because some days your spouse isn't going to act very lovably. They're not going to be very lovable. Maybe Tuesday of this week. And you're like, whoa, all right, because I love you, Jesus, I will try to love them. I'll try to forgive. I'll try to be patient. I'll try to be generous. The more we love God, the more we love each other. How do we foster that love of God? Exactly what you're doing this morning. We come to Mass. We let Jesus challenge us in the Scriptures, and we receive his grace in Holy Communion to motivate us to live our marriage well. It's not easy. We know that. You've experienced it. Two people getting along, loving your neighbor. Not easy. How do we do that throughout the week? So Sunday Mass, daily prayer, also monthly confession. Examining our marriage, bringing it to God, seeking his mercy, and then getting grace to try again. And then Paul breaks it down. Well, what is the relationship between the wife and the husband? They're different. They're equal. Be subordinate to each other. Church emphasizes our equal dignity. Pagan religions do not emphasize the dignity of husband and wife, especially the wife. Christianity, equal but different. Many today aren't so sure we're different. We are different. We're complementary. The husband and wife each bring something different to the relationship. So you have different ways you're going to divvy up your responsibilities and the way you serve your marriage. Paul says, wives, be subordinate to your husbands. Whoa! What's that? But he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Jesus died for the church. Die for your wives. Love her as yourself. You're equals. So serve each other according to your abilities. It's not a competition. He says it's like Jesus and us. God came to earth, but not to rule it over us. He said, I don't call you slaves, I call you friends. Marriage is a friendship. It's the deepest kind of friendship. It's a covenant. It's a promise till death do part. But it's not about having authority or power or controlling each other, manipulating each other. That's a sin. It's about serving each other. If husbands are willing to die for their wives and die to themselves and put their wife first, they're going to trust the husband as you make decisions for each other and for the family. And then Paul continues, and this is a great mystery. I mean, in reference to Christ and the church. That marriage is something visible. It's a man and a woman making an agreement. But it's not just a civil contract. We should make that promise before God. It has a supernatural reality. If you live marriage well, you'll go to heaven. It's the way you love your neighbor. Let me introduce you to your neighbor. Husband, meet your wife. Wife, meet your husband. The Greek word is mysterium. And when it's translated into English, it's mystery. But when it's translated into Latin, it's sacramentum. So Paul is saying this is a great sacrament. Jesus has made marriage one of the 7 sacraments. So Christians get married through the Catholic Church, making the promise before God, and then we get a special grace to live it well. Some Catholics, not knowing this, are getting married in civil ceremonies without the participation of the church. And they're living married like something's not right here, something's not clicking. Yeah. Jesus made it a sacrament and you haven't received the sacrament. And anyway, why would you, like the governor of Maryland or the county executive of Howard County, he doesn't define your relationship, your vocation as husband and wife, right? Don't just have a civil ceremony, have a religious ceremony. God defines your relationship. The state has a right to know, but God first. But to get the sacrament, to get the blessing, to get the help we need, marriage is tough. It's beautiful, but it's tough. If some of us have been married maybe outside the church without the church's participation, just come and talk to one of the priests or deacons and we can bring your marriage into the church, give you the sacrament of matrimony. But trying to love each other unconditionally as Jesus does to us. How do we live this out? How do we put this into practice in our marriages? Remember, love is a choice. We fall in love, we're attracted to someone. God gives us this beautiful experience of falling in love. But that feeling then culminates in the choice on the wedding day. I choose to serve you till death do us part. To hang in there, to try to love you unconditionally, not give up on you. Please don't give up on me. Marriage is beautiful when both are doing it, right? But we know sometimes one has to pull the load. The other slacks off a bit, but hopefully later they make up for it. Keep recommitting to that every day, every week at Sunday Mass, every year on your anniversary. Husbands, anniversaries are important. Remember the anniversary. Put it in your phone calendar. Every year, caps, anniversary. Put it in 2 weeks ahead of time, anniversary coming up. Repeat annually. We need to keep recommitting. It's not easy. Remember your first love. It's good to do an examination of conscience of our marriages. As I said, bring it to confession. If every married couple every 4 weeks came and examined how have I treated my spouse, and be honest, confess it, receive mercy and grace to come and try again, I think our marriages would be much stronger. Marriages struggle. Some of us have experienced separation. It's sad. It's a cross. Examine our marriages. Some little examination. Do I compliment my spouse or do I criticize my spouse? Am I too critical? I'm always recognizing the faults and not the good things. There will always be faults, but there's always good things. Which do you focus on? Which do you highlight? Have I lost my temper with my spouse, or have I been tender with my spouse? Have I used angry words or angry actions? Do I consider my spouse or do I ignore my spouse? Do I come home from work and then just kind of tune out, go to another room, sit in my chair, go on my phone? Am I considering my spouse? What's going on in her life, his life? Draw them out. How is your day? Do I affirm my spouse or do I belittle them? Do I talk badly about them to others? Or I'm always trying to encourage them, affirm them. We all lack self-confidence to some degree. We need that affirmation to build us up. A good question when you examine your relationship, how can I be more generous? Maybe you haven't done bad things, but how can I be more generous? Maybe I can give gifts or notes or a kind word. How can I serve them? We kind of divide up duties in marriage, but sometimes you can do the other person's duty if you have some time. It's not exclusive. How can I serve my spouse? How can I help them be more generous? Examine that. Maybe every 4 weeks or so, bring it to confession, be honest with yourself, receive grace, and move forward. So my brothers and sisters, this good challenge, trying to love unconditionally in marriage, like King Louis and Queen Marguerite. Serve your spouse out of reverence for them. Serve your spouse out of reverence for Christ. Amen.